Have you ever read a story that Jesus told and just thought, wait, what? Well, today we're tackling one of his absolute strangest. It's a parable that starts out as a royal wedding, but takes a hard left turn into murder, a city getting burned to the ground, and a guest being violently thrown out, all because he wore the wrong thing. So let's get into it and crack the code of this killer wedding feast.
Right off the bat, you have to ask, what are we even dealing with here? Is this a story about a happy celebration or a brutal massacre? This crazy contradiction is the whole point. It's what tells us there's a deep mystery we're supposed to solve.
I mean, just look at the chain of events. It's one insane escalation after another. The guests don't just send their regrets, they actually kill the messengers. And the king's reaction? It's not just to get angry, it's to literally annihilate them. And after all that, the story still ends with one more guy getting a shocking punishment. This is definitely not your average wedding story.
Okay, to get to the bottom of this, we've got to go back to the source. We're going to unpack the evidence, piece by piece, straight from Matthew chapter 22.
On the surface, the setup sounds pretty normal. A king is throwing a wedding for his son, he sends out the invitations, but the VIPs all flake. So what does he do? He opens up the party to anybody and everybody. Seems fair enough, right? Well, this is where things start to get really weird.
And here it is. This is the moment the king's reaction just goes completely off the rails. This isn't just a host being a little disappointed. The violence is so extreme, so disproportionate. He doesn't just go after the murderers, he burns their entire city to the ground. That detail is a massive red flag that something much deeper is being talked about here.
So after that whole massacre, the king tells his servants, okay, plan B, go out to the main roads and just grab anyone you can find. The text specifically says they gathered both bad and good. The wedding hall is finally packed, but this strange mix of guests is what sets the stage for the story's final and maybe most confusing twist.
And that brings us to the most bizarre part of this whole parable. The focus suddenly zooms in from a citywide war to one guy's wardrobe.
The king walks into the feast, looks around at all these new guests, and singles out just one man with this question. Now, you're probably thinking what I was thinking. Hold on a minute. You just dragged this guy in off the street. What did you expect him to be wearing? It seems incredibly unfair.
But here's the crucial detail. The man's reaction. He's speechless. And according to the analysis of this story, that silence is basically an admission of guilt. It implies that everyone, as they came in, was offered the proper wedding clothes at the door. But this man, he deliberately refused to put them on. His problem wasn't that he didn't have the right clothes. It was an act of refusal. Okay, so this clearly isn't about fashion. It's a symbol for something else. And to figure out what it means, we have to start thinking like Jesus' original audience. We have to look for a hidden code that points back to the Hebrew scriptures.
And that kind of code actually has a name. It's called a raz. A raz is like a hint, a secret, a little breadcrumb that a rabbi would plant in a story. It was an invitation for his students to go digging in the scriptures to find the deeper meaning. It's basically the decoder ring we need for this story. The main raz right here, the big flashing light in this parable, is the wedding garment. Jesus uses the symbol of clothing because he knows his audience would immediately get it. They know it has a rich, deep history in their scriptures, and that it's not about literal clothes at all.
So let's look at our first clue. This one's from the prophet Isaiah. See the language here? God clothes his people with salvation and righteousness. This sets up a really clear pattern. In the Old Testament, being clothed by God is a powerful metaphor for being in a covenant relationship with him. And it's not a one-off thing. We see it again here in Ezekiel, where God describes his relationship with Jerusalem like he's clothing a bride for her wedding. The pattern is crystal clear. God providing the clothes is a symbol of the relationship itself. So refusing to wear the clothes, well, that means you're rejecting the relationship.
So, we have our clues. We know what the code is. Now we just need to connect it to the final piece of the puzzle, a specific warning from another prophet that tells us exactly what sin this man's clothing, or a lack thereof, really represented.
And boom, here it is. This is the connection that cracks the whole case wide open. On the left, you've got our guest without the right wedding garment. And on the right, from the prophet Zephaniah, you have God condemning priests who wear foreign attire. The argument is that these are two sides of the exact same coin, wearing the wrong clothes.
So what did foreign attire mean back then? It wasn't about fashion from another country. No, it was a well-known symbol for idolatry.
It meant you were adopting the religious practices and giving your allegiance to the gods of other nations. It was a sign of spiritual betrayal.
Zephaniah spells out their crimes so clearly. These priests were trying to play both sides. Sure, they'd go through the motions of swearing allegiance to the God of Israel, but then they would also turn around and swear allegiance to a false god like Milcom. They were totally double-minded. Their hearts were divided.
There's actually a technical term for this. It's called syncretism. It's just a fancy word for trying to merge contradictory beliefs, trying to pledge your loyalty to God and to other things at the exact same time. And in the world of the Bible, that is a profound, impossible offense.
And this idea is absolutely central to Jesus' teaching. You see it right here in one of his most famous lines from the Sermon on the Mount. You have to choose. You can't serve two masters. A divided allegiance, in his eyes, is no allegiance at all. And that brings us right back to our guy at the wedding feast.
So here it is, the final piece of the puzzle. The man was thrown out not because of a fashion mistake, but because of a fatal flaw in his heart. See, he was happy to accept the king's invitation to the party, but he refused to accept the king's clothing, his righteousness, his way of life, his exclusive claim to allegiance. He wanted the perks of the kingdom without submitting to the king.
And that's what this bizarre, violent, and frankly confusing story is really all about. It's designed to force a question that cuts right through all the noise. By showing us this man's choice in such stark, dramatic terms, the parable looks at every single one of us and asks, where is your ultimate allegiance? Are you trying to serve two masters? Is your heart whole, or is it dangerously divided?